So you hit the nail on the head. I've actually been playing the long con this entire time. We reviewed 2 Star Trek movies, and I purposely didn't mention that I'm a huge, Trekkie, and that I've been keeping this a secret the whole time. Like, that would have never, ever came up in one of our reviews, ever. Welcome, nerds, to another episode of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a weekly nerd culture podcast that discusses the culture through various segments. You can find us on all of the social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Twitter and Instagram are both at the Nerds Podcast. You can check out basically all of our content on our website, thenerdspodcast.com. You can also check out our YouTube channel, The Nerds You're Looking For, on YouTube, of course. And then you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking at gmail.com. I forgot the last part of that email for a second there. I am with my co-host, as always, the Tango to my Cash, that Tyler Hunt. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty well, man. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a weird week. I have a couple of stories I want to share with you really quickly. It's been, like I said, a very weird week. So I talked about this a little bit last week. I think I mentioned it in passing that I finally kind of got pre-selected for jury duty, and that was supposed to happen on Friday. So basically you fill out this packet and then they will send you a letter saying that you got pre-selected and then you have to come for the actual jury selection on a certain day. And that was supposed to be Friday. Because I have to get paid for that day from the company that I work for, I had to do all this paperwork and stuff, get it all situated, and they had to cover for me to be gone. People had to basically pull double duty and make sure my work got done while I wasn't there. And so all of that stuff happened, and then you're supposed to call this number the night before, and I call a couple times, it rings busy, but then I finally get a hold of them, and it turns out I don't have to go. So I was kind of relieved, but also kind of disappointed because I was looking forward to not having to go to work that day. And also I just kind of wanted to experience it. I definitely did not want to get selected, but I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't at least get to kind of experience that and see what it was all about. So I was a little bit bummed about that. I still have until I think September 28th because they give you a time period on that first packet that you get. You could get a letter from this date to this date. And then after that, I think it rotates and you can't be selected for X amount of time or whatever. So I'm definitely interested to see if I'm going to get another letter, which kind of sucks because I'm going to have to go through that whole process again. And maybe I don't have to go again. And so it was kind of weird because then I had been telling people, oh yeah, I'm not going to be at work on Friday. I'm not going to be at work on Friday. And then of course I had to go, which was weird because I got to work. I had to call my boss and tell her basically that I didn't have to go. And then I got to work and of course 3 or 4 people, oh, I thought you weren't going to be here today. And so I had to tell the whole story, which was annoying, but I'm almost kind of glad that it happened because something happened Thursday night, Friday morning that is the craziest fucking story that I would have eventually heard it, of course, when I got back on Monday, or on Tuesday, because I work Tuesday through Saturday. But I'm so glad that on Friday morning, got to hear the story. So on third shift, some guy got through one of our gates. This random guy in a pickup truck got through one of our gates. And our office and warehouse is right next to the airport. And he parked in our parking lot, in the middle of where we park a lot of our trucks and stuff like that. He just parked in the middle, left his doors open, lights on. Apparently he had his shoes sitting next to his truck. So he took his shoes off for some strange reason. And he jumped the fence for the airport and was arrested running down the runway of this airport at midnight. And of course he was wasted. And it was funny because the guy that was there that was telling me the story was like, yeah, we went out and looked at his truck, and we were trying to figure out like who it was. And after like 15 minutes, we just decided to call the cops, and the cops were like, "What's the guy's name?" And they had found his wallet in his truck, and they told the cops what his name was. And they're like, "Oh yeah, we figured that's who it was, and we've already arrested him." And what's even worse about that story is like the rest of the day we had to deal with like these law enforcement people coming into our building, like Homeland Security, TSA, airport security, because they needed like official statements from us and stuff like that. So that was kind of crazy. So that was my Friday. And then come Saturday, like I said, I work Tuesday through Saturday. So Saturday morning, I had to get up and go to work. And I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. I had a dead battery in my car, and it just wouldn't start. And it was a whole deal that I had to deal with at work one day. And I got in my car Saturday morning, and my car wouldn't turn over at all. Like, it wouldn't click. It wouldn't do anything. I was like, fuck. So I had to take my wife's car to work. And I was just like, what could it possibly be? Because it can't be the battery, because they just changed the battery. And I was like, well, it's got to be in my starter. So I go home Saturday, and I was like, I'm going to tinker with it. But as you probably know, Tyler, I'm not the best with cars. Like, I don't really know that much about cars. I'm not much of a man. I'm kind of a man boy, so I don't really know that much. But as soon as I opened up the hood, I was like, those motherfuckers. They just didn't connect the thing, like they didn't tighten the nut very much on one of the negative cable, and so it just had come loose. So it was just hanging there. I was like, you motherfuckers, like if I could fix something in a car, like if I can fix a mistake that you did as a mechanic on my car, you done fucked up. Because I don't know how to do anything with cars. And so I was like, you motherfuckers. Like, it would have been such an easy fix, too. It end up being an easy fix. I just couldn't fix it because I was kind of running behind that morning. So I didn't even bother, like, popping the hood. As soon as it wouldn't start, I was just like, motherfucker. And I just ran inside, got my wife's keys, and left. But as soon as I opened up that hood, I was like, those stupid idiots. Like, you're killing me. You're killing me right now. So that was my Thursday through Saturday. It was kind of a crazy couple of days.
Yeah, man, that's a lot to unpack. That one, I mean, obviously the story that happened at your work is pretty crazy. Like I've never been so drunk to the point that I'm like, I'm going to go to the nearest airport and run down the runway. What drives a person to want to do that? I'm even curious.
Yeah, it's so weird. I ended up looking it up because, I mean, obviously a lot of the news stations around Evansville picked that all up, and it was just so weird because the way that they described it, like there's like a fire station at the airport, and like he was running down the runway, and I guess when the cops came out there, he like tried to like dash into that fire station and hide in there. It's so weird because he took his shoes off and he had to climb. The fence is really high and it has barbed wire at the top of it. I guess he like threw his jacket over the barbed wire or something. I don't know. He was really committed to getting into the airport, and it was like at midnight. So, I mean, it's a small airport, so it's not like anything was going on. It was just an empty airport. It was so weird.
Yeah, that nothing about that adds up. It's a strange situation, man. Like, I don't get it, but yeah, it sucks about your car. Obviously, I guess that's what happened. Because I think that's happened to me before. Like, my battery didn't die. It just became disconnected. So did you actually take it to a mechanic, or did you go to like AutoZone or something and get a new battery?
No, I actually took it to a mechanic. Now, changing out a battery is not that hard. I mean, I've done it actually before. It's really super, super easy. That's one of the things on my car that I can actually do myself. But because of the situation that my car was just stuck at my work, that like couple weeks ago when it happened, I have a motor club through my work, and so I just had them tow it for free to the place, the actual mechanic that I always take my car to, and they just changed it out for me while I was at work, and then I just went and picked it up after I was done. So it was super convenient. It sucked that I had to like orchestrate all of that while I was at work trying to actually do my job. So that was kind of a pain in the ass, but it actually kind of worked out pretty conveniently because then it was done while I was at work. But then, of course, they didn't fucking... I guess he missed the day of mechanic school that says you need to tighten this fucking thing when you connect it to the battery because, yeah, it was just fucking hanging there.
Do you think that that actually justifies an entire day of mechanic school, or do you think that that's maybe just like a portion of the day?
Well, I mean, I did not attend at all to mechanic school, and it took me all of 10 minutes to do, and that was just because my ratchet set is not super organized, and I had to like fidget around with it for a little bit to figure out which one fit the actual nut on it. But other than that, actually a person that knows what they're doing probably would have taken them 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
All right, so that was a really long intro. We don't usually go that long if this is your first episode, but like I said, it's been kind of a weird week. We normally start off each episode by kind of just checking in with each other. We call it What We're Into. So what are you into this week?
I hesitantly want to talk about Who is America?
Okay.
Which is, for those of you not paying attention, it's a new show on Showtime. It's 3 weeks in. There'll be a new episode tonight, but we're recording this on Sunday, so I've only seen the first 3 episodes, but it's the new Sacha Baron Cohen show. It was filmed in secret pretty much over the last year, and it's essentially like that classic brand of Sacha Baron Cohen comedy, like Borat, Bruno, the Ali G show, where he's in a disguise and he's interviewing people and saying and doing outrageous things, and it's kind of just trying to get a reaction from them, or in this case, getting them to do and say really dumb and embarrassing things, and then obviously putting it on television. So I said I wanted to hesitantly talk about it because as you can imagine, it's a very political show, and Pat and I try not to get too much into politics on this show, but if you've listened for a long time, or if you know us personally, you could probably easily guess which way we swing when it comes to politics and our views. But that being said, like, I'm going to try to stay as neutral as possible and talking about this show and kind of summing up the first 3 episodes and what I think of it. So unlike Borat or Bruno, and I guess probably more in line with the Ali G show, it's not Sacha Baron Cohen doing one character in particular. There's been, I believe, 4 characters that he's done throughout these 3 episodes so far. There's Billy Wayne Ruddock Jr., who is a conservative who really involves himself in conspiracy theories. He's all about fake news. He runs a website called truthbrary.com, which of course is a take on library, and it's a real website, so I definitely suggest you check it out. There's Rick Sherman, who's only popped up once. He is an ex-convict who discovered during his time in prison that he could make beautiful art with his bodily fluids. And the one scene that he's in is him going to like a high-end art dealer and trying to sell his artwork made of human feces and, jizz and that kind of stuff. So he's only popped up that one time, but definitely gross. There's Dr. Naira Kane, who is a liberal, like extreme liberal. Like, in his little intro, he says like he respects all 26 genders, and he has like a long ponytail, but he's bald up top, and that kind of guy. Just a big stereotype of that. So he's popped up a few times. And then the person who's the character that's popped up the most is a character named Aaron Murad, who is a retired colonel from the Israeli army. And he's definitely been kind of the center of most of the sketches, especially with a lot of politicians that are pretty prominent. So like I said, there's 3 episodes, and I kind of wanted to highlight like one specific thing from each episode and kind of just talk about my thoughts on the show in general. So this has picked up a lot of attention from mainstream media because, again, it's Sacha Baron Cohen basically duping high-profile politicians in a lot of cases. In the first episode, it got a lot of traction because it was the Aaron Murad character who was trying to put together a video and a program for Congress to arm students from age 3 to 16. And I forget what the program was called, but it was something around kindergarten. But it was basically him putting together this video, and it's just hilariously not realistic. It's like a teddy bear that's also a gun and things like this. But the crazy thing, of course, is that like there's these politicians that are buying into it. At one point, he goes to Congress, and this politician says, "So you want me to basically say on tape that I support arming 3-year-old children. And he goes, yeah, I do. And he's like, no, get out. But then it immediately shows all of these other politicians that like immediately agreed to it. So just really crazy stuff, but still pretty funny because it's so outlandish. Episode 2, there was a skit with a Republican state representative from Georgia named Jason Spencer. And in this video, again, it's the Aaron Murad character, the Israeli colonel, teaching him how to defend himself from terrorists. So it's hard to talk about this without sounding offensive because the whole video is offensive, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But I'm not going to sum up what all Jason Spencer says and does, but it's pretty cringeworthy. It's a situation where it's not funny. It's just really sad that this person is a representative from Georgia and he's saying and doing in particular things. Like there is a part that's kind of funny where he says that the best way to defend yourself from a terrorist is to show your bare ass, because they're afraid that if your bare ass touches you, they will become homosexual. So you have this state representative from Georgia with his pants pulled down and his ass hanging out, and he's basically being taught how to defend himself by backing his ass into the terrorist and saying, I'll turn you homosexual. So yeah, you can see how like that's just one thread of like the many offensive things that go on in this skit, but it kind of shows just like how off center this guy is, and he's like fucking representing a state. It just blows my mind. And then episode 3, there is the highlight for me was again around the Aaron Murad character. He is trying to teach 3 Trump supporters how to lure and trap illegal immigrants from Mexico, because that's a big deal to them. And what he does is he has them set up a fake quinceañera, which of course is the coming of age party for girls in Mexican culture whenever I think they turn 15. And it involves like one of the Trump supporters being dressed up like he's having his quinceañera and he's a 15-year-old girl. He ends up having like the police come. Like there's these 2, I'm assuming they're actors, but these Trump supporters don't know it, and the police bust it and think that they're trying to lure underage girls, and it's pretty hilarious what happens. And I don't want to get into specifics again, but that was definitely a really good skit. So that all that aside, like I loved Borat and I love Bruno, if you can't tell. Obviously, I think that Borat had its time in the limelight and now it's viewed kind of as a tired joke, but I always thought Bruno was underrated. I love how Sacha Baron Cohen is able to get his point across through comedy, and he does so by offending everyone, not just one group. Like he doesn't steer clear of stereotypes, and his characters typically are like walking stereotypes, and that's kind of how he shows how crazy some opinions are. No stereotype is off limits to him, and I really appreciate how his brand of humor is not safe and it doesn't pull any punches. In an age where everyone pretty much gets offended, I appreciate that this show is on the air. I will say that it definitely aims to get a point across around Trump's America, and there is the character that I mentioned of Nigel Kane, who is definitely a take on the stereotypes of extremely liberal people, but 95% of this show, I would say, is about showing the ugly side of conservative America. Like I mentioned, we don't get political on the podcast, and I'll kind of keep my opinions to myself, but I mentioned specifically with that Jason Spencer skit that while there are definitely really funny moments on the show, some of it gets really, really sad. To see how certain people think or behave around certain circumstances is cringeworthy, and I'm sure that's what Sacha Baron Cohen's going for here, but it's almost tough to watch in a couple places. It's not like Borat, it's not like Bruno where you laugh a lot. I've definitely sat through entire snippets of episodes where I just kind of felt disgusted and kind of gross. The Jason Spencer one was definitely one in particular. But there was also a town hall meeting that the character of Dr. Nigel Kane does in Kingsman, Arizona, where he's informing some local citizens of a potential financial investment for their community that involves constructing the world's largest mosque outside of the Middle East. And the way that these people act and the things that they say are horrendous, and just they make you want to almost throw up the way that these people see things. And it's like, again, it's not funny. It's just sad. So that would be my only complaint here. I think the show is important, and it's easy to write it off as like a prank show, but it's a lot more than that. And when it's funny, it's great. But honestly, like even the quote unquote sad parts that are cringeworthy and hard to watch are really important too. So yeah, I typically don't like getting political like that, but it is a pretty good show, and I would encourage you to give it a go.
Yeah, I definitely want to watch this show eventually. When I think I'll probably wait until it's over, like it has its run, and then I can just binge all of it at once. But I have seen a few clips. I think my favorite is probably the Roy Moore stuff with the pedophile alarm thing. Like that one was pretty funny. I enjoy that because, again, I'm not trying to get too political, but Roy Moore is a fucking piece of shit. So
yeah.
Yeah, so I like that somebody kind of made fun of him and kind of put him in his place. But I've always thought that he was really funny. It's just kind of weird that you bring this show up because I recently finished the newest episode of our friends over at The Obsessive Viewer, their podcast, and Matt from The Obsessive Viewer mentioned that he is slowly compiling his top 100 favorite movies of all time, and I mentioned this before, but a lot of my best ideas are ideas that I've stolen from you, Tyler, or Matt, or whatever. And I texted him as soon as I heard that. I was like, you know what? I'm probably going to do that too. And I went through my Blu-ray collection and stuff like that, and I compiled a list of 180, I think is my initial list, and then I will, of course, pare it down, and it probably take me about a year because I want to watch a lot of them. I actually eventually want to watch all of them and kind of give a proper star rating and a proper rating or ranking to all of them, kind of like what I did with when I rewatched all the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies to make that list, which is obviously a lot smaller list than my top 100 favorite of all time. And the reason I bring that up is because Borat made that initial list. I don't know if it's going to make the final list. It's definitely one that I'm going to rewatch before I take it off the list, because I want to pare it down to about 130 and then watch like the ones that are kind of on the bubble, and then that's how I'm going to make my decision how I'm going to pare it down to 100, and then I'm going to watch the 100, and that's how I'm going to come up with the ranking. So it's probably going to take me a good year and a half, but it's going to be a fun little project that I'm going to eventually kind of unveil. The list on Letterboxd right now is obviously private until I finish the project, but it's definitely something that I'm looking forward to, and I think that he is really funny. I didn't really like Bruno as much as you did. I think we saw it together actually in the theaters when it first came out, and I think that we definitely disagree on it being as funny. Like, I think you think obviously is a lot more funny than I did.
Yeah, so back to the 100 favorite movies thing real quick. So for what it's worth, I started doing this back in March or April, and I've had a private list on my Letterboxd. So it's something that I'm not like too concerned with right now, but whenever I do get to the point that I want to make it unprivate, I just want to put it out there that I am not ripping Matt off. So I had no idea he was doing that, but yeah, that's a fun thing that I've kind of been working on too. But yeah, all that aside, like, watch Who's America. So what are you into this week?
So I went and saw a movie with my wife, which actually we don't go see movies together as often as we used to, but it was definitely a movie that we were both really, really looking forward to because it was a movie that I had heard a lot of good things about, and it's also written and directed by Bo Burnham. It is Eighth Grade, which, again, written and directed by Bo Burnham, who is a stand-up / musician that I think you're a bigger fan of him than I am. Like, I can appreciate what he does and that it takes a lot of talent to do what he does. It's not quite my cup of tea, but I do appreciate it as like, okay, that does take a lot of work and it does take a lot of talent to do that, but it's just not quite my cup of tea. But I loved this movie. I was really just kind of blown away by this movie. For those that aren't aware, it stars Elsie Fisher, who is, I didn't know her going into this movie, but apparently she does the voice for Agnes in the Despicable Me movies. So that's kind of cool. I did not know that about her. I looked that up after the fact. She stars as Kayla, who is in the 8th grade, obviously, and she's super socially awkward, and she probably has some mental health issues as far as like social anxiety. She definitely has social anxiety, but maybe even a little depression as well. They don't really go into particulars in the actual movie what she's actually suffering from, but she obviously has some social awkwardness to her for sure, and she is kind of trying to work around those things and try to get out more and make new friends. And one way that she does this is she actually has a YouTube channel, which literally as the movie starts, you see her doing a YouTube video. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of cute, because if you don't know, Bo Burnham, that's kind of how he started. That isn't kind of how he started. It is how he kind of started. And, like, that's how he became famous. He started doing a lot of his songs and stuff on YouTube, and he kind of just branched off from there. So when I saw that, I originally thought, okay, that's just kind of a wink and a nod to how he started. But I was actually really impressed with the fact that that actually plays a huge role in this movie, because they use it as a way to kind of structure this movie. Because a lot of the times what her channel is about is she kind of tries to give advice to teenagers, how to fit in and how to make friends. And obviously she's really socially awkward. So she struggles with a lot of that stuff. And it's definitely a case of, and I don't really particularly like this expression, but you hear it a lot, those that can't teach. And it's definitely one of those situations where she's better at giving advice than she is actually taking her own advice. And a lot of times in this movie, you will only hear the audio of her videos, and it'll be playing over us seeing her essentially deal with a situation that she's talking about, giving advice about in that particular video. And she's completely mucking it up, but yet she's talking like she's an expert on her YouTube channel. So I thought that was kind of funny. This movie is not quite as funny as I thought it would be, especially considering he's a stand-up comedian. You would think that it was going to be really funny. It's more of a kind of a coming-of-age kind of teen drama type of movie. There are some really, really funny parts, especially there's one part between her and her dad, which is played by Josh Hamilton, which Elsie Fisher is amazing in this movie, but Josh Hamilton is great in it as well. He kind of steals the show as her dad. And the funniest moment is between those two. And it's really hilarious. I don't want to ruin anything for you, but yeah, it's really, really funny. But that was kind of the one really laugh out loud moment. Most of this movie, because she's so socially awkward, is very, very hard to watch at points. Like, Bo Burnham does a really good job. And I don't think you see this much with rookie directors, because this is his first feature-length film. Like, I think a lot of rookie directors would cut away from certain scenes, but he just like sits in the awkwardness, and it does make it hard to watch at times, but I do appreciate kind of what he was trying to do. This character obviously struggles with a lot of this stuff, and I know that, and I don't know a ton about this, but I know that he has talked a lot in the past about how he kind of struggles with that a little bit. Like, he's much more comfortable with writing than he is performing. And so I think that a lot of that comes through in this movie, because I feel like he kind of puts a lot of that on this character, and it's a great kind of look at how people deal with these certain things. And it definitely hit home for me, because I used to struggle with that a lot as a kid, especially when I was that age. I was super socially awkward, and I definitely had a lot of social anxiety. And it's kind of funny, because now that I do this podcast and I do the YouTube channel and I do stand up, like, my aunts and uncles that knew me when I was back in that age, they're super surprised that I do what I do, because I was so socially awkward. I probably have shared this story on the podcast before, but like, when we would go on like long road trips as a family, sometimes we would stop at like gas stations or whatever, and I would get out of the car, and then I would get back in, and we'd be like 30 minutes down the road, and my parents would like freak out and look behind and make sure I was still there, because I just didn't talk at all. Like, I never talked when I was a little kid. And so a lot of that has to do with the fact that I was hearing impaired. And so I kind of talked funny a little bit. I had to take a lot of speech classes because of it. But I was definitely had a lot of that social anxiety. So a lot of this movie really hit home for me. And I definitely think that I'm pretty certain that there's no way that this movie is not going to be in my top 10 at the end of the year, because I really fell in love with it.
Yeah, so I saw this movie last Tuesday. I had a day off during the week, which is rare for me, and I loved it. Honestly, when this movie was announced, I almost didn't want to root for it, and this is going to sound really fucking dumb, but this is just how my brain works. So, like, I'm obviously a pretty big fan of Bo Burnham's stand-up, and he pretty much made a big deal about his last special on Netflix being his last one. And then this was his project he did next. So I felt like he was kind of cheating on his stand-up with this movie. And being, like I said, being such a big fan of his stand-up, I was kind of like, well, shit, like, we have this movie. But yeah, I mean, to echo what you said, I found it to be quite amazing. Spoiler alert, it's number 1 on my top 10 of 2018 right now. So I'm obviously connected with it, and a lot of the same things you said. Like, I don't want to reiterate a bunch of points, but it just not only kind of felt, what's the word I'm looking for? It felt like very reminiscent of how I was at that age and how I still am at times at age 30. And then a lot of the stuff that she goes through in 8th grade, like, it brought me back to exact moments of whenever I was in 8th grade, which was crazy. So yeah, it definitely does a really good job of showing what it's like to be socially awkward, have social anxiety, have a touch of depression, all of that stuff. And I think that the reason it does it is, again, kind of like what you said, like, Bo Burnham struggles with that stuff himself. And because of that, it was almost like he was able to just put it up on the story or on the screen and make you feel exactly how it feels to have those things. So yeah, I don't want to just keep on reiterating the wonderful things you said about the movie, but it was really, really fantastic.
Yeah, there's a scene where she talks about, like, getting on the roller coaster and how you feel about when you're about to get on the roller coaster, and then that release after you're, like, while you're on the roller coaster and, like, after you get off, and, like, having social anxiety is, like, always waiting to be on the roller coaster, but then you never get that release. And I thought that was just such a fucking brilliant way to describe how you feel. Like, you have that nervous, like, butterflies in your stomach type of feeling all the time. And I think that's fantastic. It's such a cool way to describe that. I didn't know that you had seen this, actually, so that's kind of why I mean, of course, we always kind of tiptoe around spoilers, but I definitely, because I wanted you to see this completely fresh, so I'm glad that you liked it and you've already seen it. The part that I was referring to is the banana scene where she's eating the banana. It is by far my favorite and by far the funniest scene. Just the way the dad reacts to her and the way that she eats the banana is really, really funny.
Yeah, I thought you were either probably talking about that scene or about the scene where he's driving her to the mall and she is, like, just railing him for everything and anything, like, for being too quiet, and then for like, that was pretty funny too. So, and it reminded me of the way my sister used to treat my parents. So so that was that kind of hit home as well.
All right, cool, man. So yeah, I'm glad that you liked it as well. So our next segment is comics. Tyler and I read a ton of comics each week, and we like to spotlight 1 or 2 a week. And we usually call dibs, so we avoid this problem. But it turns out neither one of us thought that the other one was going to talk about this particular comic. So we're actually going to kind of pull double duty this particular episode. So it normally doesn't go this way, but we're actually going to talk about the same book. So why don't you lead off the discussion, Tyler?
Yeah, so I can kind of dig in. So we're talking about Leviathan number 1, which is an Image comic book written by John Layman, and the art is done by Nick Pitarra and Michael Garland. So typically whenever I do my little comic spiel, I kind of give a little excerpt about what it's about. So I'll go ahead and take the lead here. And this follows a couple buddies named Ryan and Johnny that are on a beer run when more people turn up to their house party, or I guess apartment party, than they were anticipating. Ryan's girlfriend Vivian stays at the party with other guests, and we find out that Ryan is going to propose to her that night. However, there's a guest at the party named Goth Jimmy that had come uninvited and then ends up convincing everyone to take place in a ceremony where they end up conjuring a Leviathan, which to me is it's a kaiju, but it looks like a giant triceratops. And the Leviathan just kills everybody at the party except for Vivian and Goth Jimmy, and then starts to destroy the city. So while that's going on, there's like a cutaway, a couple panels to the government deciding to test their new high-tech weapons, which look like the robots from Pacific Rim. And while we never see them in action, chaos does ensue the rest of the issue. So for me, this book reminded me of a mixture of Pacific Rim, This Is the End, and Cloverfield. So obviously the Pacific Rim and Cloverfield references are pretty easy to make because it's a kaiju book and there's giant monsters and giant robots, so all that stuff. But This Is the End aspect just reminded me of that movie where Seth and Jay go out to the convenience store, and that's when shit kind of starts to hit the fan, and they make their way back to the party. So that's kind of was reminiscent of that, the way that Johnny and Ryan are kind of out on a beer run. So I'm curious to hear what you thought of the book. For me, it really wasn't a cohesive story, but it was just an issue of chaos and destruction with small plot threads kind of woven in. It wasn't not necessarily a bad thing, and it doesn't really give me a lot to talk about from a writing standpoint, but honestly, I wouldn't say that that's where the book shines anyways. In my opinion, the dialogue's pretty weak and the story is somewhat straightforward, but it's not every day you get a super unique kaiju comic, and at the end of the day, you aren't reading this book for the human characters or for the dialogue or for the story. You're reading it for the monsters, and when there are monsters, the art is really important. So the art in this book is really great, but it also it's weird. It left me a little bit uneasy as well with the style. It's unique and unlike any other art I've seen in comics, but like I mentioned, it kind of left me feeling grimy after I got done reading it. I'd compare it to whenever I used to watch Beavis and Butthead whenever I was little. The character design of those characters kind of they didn't necessarily scare me, but it kind of weirded me out as a kid for some reason, and it was the same kind of situation here. But with that being said, the art is obviously a huge part of what makes this book interesting. The character and the creature design are all great. The beautifully drawn carnage is awesome, and it's just a lot to take in every page. Typically, I don't shout out the person who colors in the lines if you're familiar with Chasing Amy, but I did call out Michael Garland at the beginning of this. I did want to point him out because the colors used here really pop and are really, really vibrant and crazy. And it almost feels like a concert poster from the 60s or from like a psychedelic band, which is a good thing because, again, it's unique. So, for me, overall, this comic doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel, and it's not the best work of fiction out there, but it definitely gets the job done, and it grabs you by the balls for about 20 pages. So it's kind of up in the air if I'm going to keep up. It's a 5-issue miniseries, but I got to say, like, the first issue was kind of a thrill ride.
So it sounds like you liked it a little bit more than I did. So just judging by the concept, and I think you explained it pretty well, I thought it was going to be a lot more campy and fun than it ultimately ended up being. And maybe, like you said, it is a 5-issue miniseries, so maybe the next 4 issues are going to get more campy and more tongue-in-cheek and more fun. This issue just really kind of laid everything out on the table. And now that they've gotten that out of the way, that maybe they can have more fun with the concept here in a little bit. I did get some Cloverfield vibes, obviously, with his girlfriend still being at the party. And once the shit hits the fan, he does become very determined to get back to her. So I obviously got some serious Cloverfield vibes from that. I didn't pick up on the This Is the End stuff. So I'm glad that you read this book as well and were able to add that to the discussion, because I didn't pick that up, but that's a good comparison. Like, as soon as you started saying that, I was like, yeah, that does make sense. Like, it does kind of influence this book. I don't know if it was a actual direct influence, but it would make sense if they came out and said that. And again, I would definitely understand if they came out and said that Cloverfield directly influenced this book as well, because I definitely got those vibes. I just don't think that it was necessarily exposition heavy. It just it wasn't what I wanted it to be. Like, I wanted it to be like silly and not taking itself too seriously. And I don't think it did. I just didn't give me enough like camp and enough fun to keep me interested. So I just really wasn't interested in this book after the first about 10, 15 pages.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Like I said, the story isn't great and the dialogue isn't great, so I can definitely respect that opinion. I mean, obviously I'm on the fence if I'm even going to continue with it when the next issue comes out, so I guess I can't recommend it too much.
All right, man. That's cool. So are you ready for nerd news?
Yeah, man. So just a few stories we can probably get through pretty quick. The first is that there was a new Venom trailer released, and whenever we talked about the first Venom trailer towards the beginning of this year, we mentioned, like, you know, that first trailer does not show Venom. And then the second trailer showed Venom a little bit. And we mentioned that there would probably be a third and or fourth trailer before the movie comes out in October that would spill its symbiotic load. And this trailer did it. So I'm curious, did you watch it?
I did.
You did or didn't?
I did. Yeah, I did.
Okay, yeah. What'd you think, man?
I'm pretty excited about this movie. I mean, I definitely still have reservations for it, but I thought the trailer looked pretty cool. I thought some of the dialogue was, I don't know if cringy would be the right word for it. I thought some of it was kind of weird. Like, I thought the turd in the wind thing, it was kind of funny. But at the same time, like, I think his delivery of some of the lines in that little diatribe or whatever you want to call it, I thought kind of made it more funny than it necessarily would have been otherwise. But the turd in the wind thing was pretty stupid. But I was surprised at how much I liked it, considering it does show a lot of Venom in it.
Yeah, so we're on opposite ends of the spectrum here. I think that it does not look great.
Really?
So, yeah, I don't know. I think that in the back of my mind, maybe some of it is just because I'm so upset that they're making a Venom movie without Spider-Man, which I won't, go back to that point that I've made numerous times as we've talked about this movie. But his whole, like, Venom's whole monologue in this trailer I thought was pretty bad. There's a portion where his kind of face peels back and Venom and Eddie Brock are both say "we are Venom," and I thought that looked really shitty. There were some cool action pieces, so I'm holding out hope that we get some really awesome symbiotic action in this film, which I'm sure we'll get. But at the end of the day, like, I just can't imagine that the story is going to be there.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the part that I'm most nervous about, is just the story is going to be really shitty. I will say, as far as Venom's concerned, like, it was a little kind of hard to understand what he was saying at times. Like, I think they overproduced his voice a little bit, so that was a little bit distracting, and hopefully it'll just be one of those things that once you hear it for a little bit, you can kind of pick it out a little bit better. Hopefully it's not going to be like Bushmaster territory where there's no way that I'm ever going to understand what the fuck he's saying. But I actually watched this trailer a couple of times, and when I was watching it, I kind of started to pick up what he was saying a little bit easier. So I think that just throughout the course of this movie, it's going to be a little bit easier to hear what he's saying and understand what he's saying. But I don't have the same reservations, it sounds like you do, because I think that some of the Venom stuff I actually thought looked pretty cool. So I definitely think it looks a lot better than Spider-Man 3 did. So I think this is a lot closer to the Venom that I wanted in that movie.
Yeah, man, I definitely would agree with that. Like, the character design is much better even without the white spider on his chest. Like, it still looks like Venom, like the Venom we know and we love. So yeah, I mean, we'll see this movie, we'll review it, but that trailer did not get me, not a single trailer so far has gotten me amped for it, so we'll see.
Cool, man.
Speaking of Spider-Man villains that are getting movies without the character himself, they are moving ahead with a Kraven the Hunter movie over at Sony. They recently hired the writer of, I believe, the Equalizer movies. His name is Richard Wenk, to write this movie. He's also written The Expendables 2, The Mechanic, and the newest incarnation of the Magnificent Seven. So this dude is putting together a Craven movie.
Yeah, so this is a villain that I really like. But
Yeah.
where we talk about Venom needs Spider-Man to a certain extent, I think Venom is definitely somebody that could carry his own movie, and I guess we're about to see if he's able to carry his own movie. But Craven can't. Like, as much as I like that character, he's so dependent on Spider-Man. You can't do it without Spider-Man. He's always been one of those guys that I have been clamoring for to be the villain in, like, a Marvel Spider-Man movie, which obviously we're probably not going to see that now, because now Sony's going to make their Craven the Hunter movie without Spider-Man.
Yeah.
As much as you don't want to see a Venom movie without Spider-Man, I have more hopes that it can work than I have hopes that Craven the Hunter movie can work without Spider-Man.
No, I definitely agree with that sentiment. I think that if you were going to choose one of those two characters to work on their own, like, the obvious answer to me is Venom, even though I'm not crazy about it. Like, there's more there for that character to do on his own than Craven. Like, everything Craven does revolves around wanting to hunt Spider-Man and be a Spider-Man villain. I just don't see how there's an interesting story to tell where Spider-Man's not involved. So I'm curious to see what this guy comes up with. But, like, the character of Craven is so long overdue as being in a Spider-Man movie. Like, some of my favorite animated Spider-Man episodes from the 90s were Craven hunting Spider-Man, because obviously he wants to hunt the ultimate game, and that's what I want to see in a movie. And I think that there's other Spider-Man villains you can bring into that are animal based too, like the Rhino and the Scorpion and even the Vulture. Like, it could be a really cool setup, but instead they're going to do something without Spider-Man. So we'll see how that goes. Do you know? So I texted you earlier this week. I went ahead and I made the plunge, and I pre-ordered the Spider-Man PlayStation 4 for whenever that comes out in September. Is Craven the Hunter in that game?
Not that I am aware of. I'm trying to kind of stay away from spoilers for that game. I know they have the Sinister Six, so I think it's going to be Scorpion, Vulture, Rhino, Mr. Negative, and I'm forgetting one or two. Who am I forgetting? Shocker. Shocker would definitely be in there. And I can't remember the other ones. But anyways, so I'm trying to stay away from, other than the E3 gameplay trailer that we saw, I'm trying to stay away from spoilers. I know a lot of the bigger gaming publications have got to play, like, not really a demo, but kind of like a preview. And they obviously are told not to spoil anything or anything like that. But I've seen them post, like, on YouTube and stuff like that they have, like, their initial reactions, and I've been trying to stay away from that. So I don't know if Craven will be in it, but I do know that, like, the older games, I do know, I'm not sure if it was Spider-Man 2 or maybe it was the first Spider-Man game, where, like, there was an Xbox version where you had Craven the Hunter, and then there was a PlayStation 2 or 3 version where Craven wasn't in it, and I thought that was pretty cool. And so obviously they can't do something like this with this game because this is a PlayStation 4 exclusive, but I did think that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that game. So, all right, 2 more quick news stories and we'll get on to our main topic. So the first one was just kind of a callback to the issues with James Gunn being fired. I don't know if you saw this week, but the Guardians of the Galaxy, the actors behind the Guardians of the Galaxy, put together a pretty long statement asking for the reinstatement of James Gunn, and all of them signed it. Everyone from Bradley Cooper to Chris Pratt. And for a second there were rumors that Disney was going to meet with James Gunn and possibly reinstate him. And then the next day there were stories saying that it was unlikely that he'd get reinstated, and it's kind of been radio silence since that. But I thought that it was interesting that not only did they kind of put out a statement, but they pretty much blatantly are saying, like, we want him reinstated, which I think is big for them to do that and kind of, like, commit to this. Because a lot of times in Hollywood, you get non-committal stuff whenever things like this pop up. And I mean, it seems like these stars are pretty adamant that they want him back as director.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of got my hopes up a little bit that this was going to be the last thing that Disney needed, because they just need an excuse, I think, at this point, because everybody, for the most part, agrees that they did the wrong thing, that they overreacted. And the thing that I've been seeing recently with the stories is the fact that Disney didn't know about the tweets, which kind of makes it worse in my book, that you hired somebody for one of your biggest franchises. And I get that Guardians wasn't a big deal at the time. It was a big gamble, but they weren't sure it was going to work the way it did. But it was still part of the MCU, which is your biggest franchise right now. So even at that point, it was your biggest franchise. So the fact that you didn't vet him, well, just points to you being incompetent. It doesn't really excuse anything for me. So yeah, that was a little annoying, and I kind of got my hopes up that they were going to reinstate him, because this just seemed like the excuse that they needed. Well, the whole cast is behind us bringing him back. Let's go ahead and say, hey, we thought about it, we've investigated, and whatever bullshit excuse they want to come up with, and we've decided to reinstate him.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm still crossing my fingers, but if they haven't made an announcement yet, it almost seems unlikely, I guess. So, the last news story I have is something that I don't know that you or I will have a ton of opinion on, unless you've secretly like a big Star Trek The Next Generation fan. Yesterday, Patrick Stewart announced that he was returning to the role of Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek The Next Generation for a new Star Trek show on the CBS streaming app, which of course has been doing what is that called? Star Trek Discovery, I believe. So yeah, he's coming back to Jean-Luc, which again, like I think you and I have both gone on record before. Like I'm a big fan of the new Star Trek movies, but that's as far as my knowledge around that franchise goes. So I think that it's cool that Patrick Stewart's going back to that role, but it's not something I could give much care about. So yeah, I felt like I had to do my due diligence and bring it up, though, for our listeners that are Star Trek fans.
So you hit the nail on the head. I've actually been playing the long con this entire time. We reviewed 2 Star Trek movies, and I purposely didn't mention that I'm a huge, Trekkie, and that I've been keeping this a secret the whole time. Like, that would have never, ever came up in one of our reviews, ever. No, obviously, I'm not a Star Trek fan. I do like the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, but other than that, I don't particularly care about this. I did watch a few episodes of Next Generation, so I'm more familiar with that than I am the original. I don't think I've ever seen the original Star Trek, like a full episode from start to finish. And I've seen a few episodes of the Next Generation, which isn't even that many, because I think there's like 6 or 7 seasons of that show. So yeah, I'm not a fan.
Cool. Well, that's it for nerd news.
All right. Well, I don't think we could get a better transition to Christopher Robin than that. That was a great segue. Anyways, of course, we're going to be reviewing Christopher Robin in this particular episode, and this movie is, of course, based on the short stories by A.A. Milne. And it is a live action adaptation of the old Disney movies. Christopher Robin was directed by Mark Forster, who also did Monsters Ball, World War Z. He also did a really underrated Will Ferrell movie called Stranger Than Fiction, which, spoiler alert, was also on my top 150 or whatever it ended up being for my top 100. I think that movie got criminally overlooked when it first came out. I really enjoy that movie, and it's one of the movies that I'm looking forward to rewatching. So he also did that movie. Christopher Robin focuses on the title character, obviously played by Ian McGregor. It focuses on him and his family. His daughter's played by Bronte Carmichael, there's no way that I pronounced her first name right, and his wife, Haley Atwell, who is best known for Peggy Carter in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. His family's weekend trip gets interrupted by a work emergency, so when Christopher Robin must stay behind due to said emergency, he is surprised by an old friend. And I don't know about you, Tyler, but I never really cared about Winnie the Pooh. I know of him, obviously, because he's a big deal. I read a few of the short stories when I was in grade school, and I think I've seen a little bit of the movies. I've never sat down and watched one of the movies from start to finish, but I've seen bits and pieces of it. So I wasn't really into this movie when I first heard about it, but I did see the trailer, obviously, leading up to this movie, because you see every trailer a million times before a movie comes out nowadays. So I did see the trailer, and did kind of remind me of the feeling I got when I first saw the trailer for Hook, which is kind of that same type of movie. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I was excited for this movie because, like I said, I don't really care about Winnie the Pooh. But if it kind of gave me that same feeling about Hook, it did move the needle a little bit, but not too much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same way. I never was a Winnie the Pooh fan growing up, as much as, like, I hate to generalize something. It almost seems like it was more geared to little girls, which is not a bad thing and definitely not anything set in stone. But like, my little sister loved Winnie the Pooh, but it was just something that I never really particularly got into. I remember, I think that, like you, I saw some bits and pieces of that original Disney adaptation, but it's not something that I've revisited or something that I was ever really huge into. That being said, similar to you, whenever this trailer came out for this movie, it really intrigued me. Not only do I love Ewan McGregor, but it definitely looked like it was going to be a movie that tugged on your heartstrings a little bit and kind of explored what it was like to lose touch with your childhood as an adult and what it would be like to kind of re-embrace those things from when you were young, which obviously plays a lot to us and to me from like a nerd culture standpoint. Like, we spend hours each week talking about things that we love because of, you know, what we liked when we were little. So I definitely had high hopes for this movie and was really looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I want to share a quick story about my movie going experience before we actually jump into the review. So my review is ultimately going to be kind of fueled by the fact that this movie is definitely geared towards kids. And I bring that up because, like I said earlier, like, you see a ton of trailers nowadays. Like, I think, like, when I was in college, I tracked previews as like at like 12 or 13 minutes. And now it seems like it's more like 18 minutes. And so now that I've gotten A-list and I've been going to see a lot more movies, I've been seeing like 2 or 3 a week nowadays for the last like 3 or 4 weeks. You see the same goddamn trailers over and over again. And I just saw Teen Titans go to the movies, which is obviously another kids movie. So I was like, I really don't want to see another trailer for Smallfoot. Like, you see that same type of trailer before Teen Titans that you will before Christopher Robin. So I was like, I'll just get to the movie a little late. Like, this shit that I used to give you a hard time when we used to go see movies, I'm starting to do. Like, this movie started at 7 o'clock. And I sat down at like 7:10, but I still had a few more previews to go. And I noticed, like, I was sitting like 3 seats away from this little girl and her mother, and they were both on their phones. But we were still in the previews, which that used to bother me, but I'm kind of over it now. As long as you get off your phone by the time the movie starts, we're good. Well, they didn't. And so like 5 minutes into this movie, I kind of look over at them, but they're still on their phones. And it's not even the way that they were on their phones, because I've been guilty of that. Especially I typically will sit in the back row. And if I am by myself in the back row, because AMC has the reclining seats now, you kind of have like a divide between the rows a little bit. So like, you can't see me if I get on my phone and you're in the row in front of me. Like, if I'm the only one in the back row, sometimes, like if it's a movie that we're reviewing, sometimes I'll jot a few notes on our Evernote or whatever. So I'm definitely guilty of getting on my phone occasionally during movies. So that doesn't necessarily bother me. It's when they're on their phones, like these people were on their phones. Like, they were just sitting in their living room watching a movie. Like, they were just scrolling through Twitter or whatever. Like, they had no care that there was anybody else sitting next to them. And so that really bothered me. And so I just kept looking over, hoping that eventually they would get off their phones. And like 20 minutes into the movie, I've already looked over at them like 3 or 4 times. So like the 4th time I look over at them, it just so happens that the mom looks over towards the kid and we kind of lock eyes. And it was the weirdest thing. Like, it was one of those situations where I thought something and that thought just came out my mouth, and I literally locked eyes with this woman, this stranger, and I said to her, "Are you kidding me right now?" And she did the thing, like when you're driving, like you can't say you're sorry to someone, like when you do something stupid and you're driving because they can't hear you, you kind of give them that stupid wave, and that's what she did. And she said something to her kid, and to their credit, never got on their phone again. But that situation could have gotten ridiculous real quick. And I kind of laughed at myself after the fact that I even said it, because it was legitimately just like one of those things where it just kind of happened. And after it happened, I was like, oh shit, like this is going to be a situation. But I mean, to her credit, like she recognized that she was doing something wrong and she had her kid put her phone away, and it was fine after that. Like I waited for the little stinger at the end of this movie and they didn't, so they had to walk by me. She wasn't weird or anything. So it ended up being like the best way that situation could have resolved itself. But it was just kind of funny that happened and that I even said this to a complete stranger.
Yeah, man, that doesn't sound like you. So you must have been at a boiling point.
Yeah, I mean, I was at work all day and it was kind of a shitty day and I was just really, really annoyed. It wasn't like it ruined the experience for me because, I mean, we're going to get into how I felt about this movie here in a little bit. I don't think it would have really bothered me with this movie, but yeah, it's so annoying. And I just like a bright light out of the corner of my eye, like the whole time. It was just super distracting.
Yeah, man, that sucks.
All right, so we break up our reviews, just like we break up the episode as a whole into different segments. And the first segment is just kind of a general overview of whatever we're reviewing. We call it Broad Strokes. Obviously, we're reviewing Christopher Robin, like we said. So how'd you feel about Christopher Robin generally?
So I had much higher hopes for this movie compared to what ended up being delivered. This movie was by no means bad, but with a film like this, I expect it to be a certain thing. I expect it to move me a certain way, especially given the trailers for this movie. But a lot what they were trying to go after kind of felt flatter than what I had hoped. To me, it should be relatively easy to craft a moving story that captures, kind of gets your buy-in and gets your attention with this premise. And I say that from like the standpoint of not that I could write a better movie, but from the standpoint that with the ammunition they had, there should have been a better moving story for them to tell here. And while some of the parts did grab me, it wasn't what I wanted given the promotional material.
I actually think you probably could have written a better movie than this. I really did not like this movie much at all. Really, there wasn't a whole lot that I connected with in this movie. And this is going to sound cliche, and I might actually throw up a little in my mouth saying something that's so cliche. But I've always kind of considered myself kind of young at heart, like a kid at heart. Like, I mean, obviously I love movies, TV. I read comic books every week. I play a lot of video games. Like I'm kind of a grown up that never really grew up. And again, that's super cliche, but that's just kind of how I view myself. And I never really felt 31 until I fucking watched this movie. And I say that because this movie was definitely not made for me, because Christopher Robin is framed in a way in this movie that he's almost kind of the villain in part of this movie. And I felt like I agreed with the decisions he made in this movie. And you're definitely not supposed to. And I just feel like any grown-up that's responsible at all should empathize with Christopher Robin in this movie. And I mean, of course, I'm going to get into particulars about the story here in a little bit, and I'll definitely pick apart this movie here in a little bit. But just as broad strokes wise, I just don't think this movie was made for me, and I never really bought into this movie because I agreed with most of the things that Christopher Robin did and said in this movie, and you're not supposed to.
I can't believe this was the movie that made Patrick Pan finally grow up.
Would you have made that joke if I didn't already bring up Hook?
Yeah, because you saying that you were young at heart and you never grew up immediately reminded me of Peter Pan, especially since we're talking about a Disney movie.
Okay, fair enough. I just felt like you kind of piggybacked off my Hook thing. All right, fair. So story-wise, what do you think of Christopher Robin?
So it's funny that I'm going to end up touching on a couple of the things that you brought up in your broad strokes. But to start off, like, I do want to say, to me, the 3 acts of this story don't line up incredibly well. Specifically, the transition from act 2 or 3 felt really off and kind of left me unbalanced for kind of the climax of the movie. While I think the idea of revisiting Christopher Robin as an adult was a really good idea in theory, they make his character almost too unlikable at the beginning of the movie, and you don't necessarily buy into his change of heart between acts 2 and 3. Spoilers. So, I mean, you have to imagine, like, if you go into this movie, you know, at some point he's going to have a change of heart. So that's where I think that I kind of am not on the same page with you, but I know where you're coming from. Like, I'm an adult man that has to provide for a family. I definitely see where you're coming from, but for me, it was too unbelievable that like one silly thing that happens in act 2 kind of gives him a different outlook on life in act 3. For me, it's not necessarily about these characters from his childhood coming to save him from what he's become, which I thought it was going to be. And it was really disappointing how indifferent he is when he's reunited with Pooh after 30 or so years. Like, he just doesn't care. And like you said, like, he's made to be the villain for most of this movie. And I agree with that. But as opposed to empathizing with him, they almost made him too unlikable, in my opinion. It was really hard to get too emotionally invested when the character is just being a dick to everybody, including a fucking stuffed bear that is supposed to pull on your heartstrings and is just so naive that it's hard for that character to do any wrong except for maybe spill honey on some shit. So in addition to all of that, I also did feel like there were some unnecessary tropes in this movie. I don't want to get into specifics because it would spoil a couple plot points, but a lot of plot points in this movie felt very familiar because we'd kind of seen it before, especially in other Disney movies. I will say the part of the story that I loved and that landed for me was the idea of a grown-up losing touch with everything he cared about to provide for his family. I'm not necessarily saying that's reflective of where I'm at in my life, but as someone who feels the pressure of providing for my wife and I sometimes catch myself too caught up with work at times when I could be spending quality time with her, especially nights where I come home from work and then I spend all evening on my laptop doing more work, and she kind of gets upset that I'm not with her. So in that regard, I appreciated the pressures of Christopher Robin in this story. And then I of course loved how the animated characters were kind of woven into that. I just wish that they had played a bigger part in changing his mindset as opposed to the way that it happens in the movie. The success of this movie definitely relies on the idea of nostalgia. And I think the nostalgia of this movie is used pretty well and not only adds charm to the storytelling, but serves almost as an important plot device as well for the Christopher Robin character. However, like, just to kind of sum things up, like, at the end of the day, there wasn't as much childhood magic as I had expected. So there was enough to keep me bought in, but I really went into this film thinking like it could be one of my favorite movies of the summer, and it just isn't. It just fell flat too many times.
Yeah, so I obviously agree with a lot of what you just said. And like I said earlier, like, I'm not super familiar with Winnie the Pooh, but maybe you can clarify this for me. But like, in the short stories and in the Disney, like the cartoon, aren't they like figments of his imagination? Like, they aren't real, right?
I don't know for sure, but I asked Brittany the same thing. I thought that it was basically this kid's stuffed animals that he uses his imagination and they come to life.
Yeah, because I don't think that they're real in the original source material. They are real in this movie, and that really bugged me. So you have to be a fucking psychopath to have a talking goddamn teddy bear and you just bail on him at like 12 or 13. Like, obviously he's forced to bail on them. Like, he like the beginning of this movie, he has to go off to boarding school, and he like has this final thing with them, like a final like hangout, like lunch or whatever with them, and he kind of says his goodbyes, but you could come back from boarding school and hang out with them again. Like, it's not like you're going away forever. And they kind of do this montage thing, which I will point out that I thought that montage was really excellent storytelling, because we always say that, especially in comics section, like, show us, don't tell us. And I thought that montage did a really, really good job of kind of showing what he goes through after he goes to boarding school without actually telling us what happens. And so I thought that was really excellent storytelling. But certain things happen to him after he goes away to boarding school that I think the filmmakers wanted us to assume, okay, that's how he forgets about them. But I kind of have the opposite reaction. I'm like, you have this talking teddy bear that you could go back and he's essentially your best friend. Like, when the shit hits the fan, like, why wouldn't you go back and like hang out with him and like have him comfort you? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I think that they tried to make it so, oh, well, all of this bad shit happened to him. It forced him to grow up really quickly. And that's why he kind of had to leave them behind. But I would have the opposite reaction. Like, I would want to constantly go back to them. And so that was kind of weird. And on the flip side of that, like, they even mention at one point, like, when they do finally reunite, like, Pooh goes through the doorway and he ends up coming out right where Christopher Robin 30 years later lives in London. And Christopher Robin's even said something to the effect like, how did you get here? And Pooh says, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's like, the door is where it needed to be, or something like that. Like, Christopher Robin is going to miss a weekend trip with his family. And I understand that that's important. I do understand that. And this is probably the straw that broke the camel's back with his family. And I get that. But the motherfucker fought in World War II, but yet he's going to miss a weekend trip with his family. And that's when Pooh shows up? Like, dude, that's some shit.
He's not going to show up in the middle of gunfire.
Well, I mean, you could still hang out and like comfort him. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, they put too much emphasis on this one thing. And that kind of leads me to my next problem with this movie. So they kind of frame Christopher Robin as being the villain, like he's making the bad choice. Well, in this movie, he is the supervisor of this department in this company, and his boss comes to him and says, hey, I need you to work this weekend. If you don't, we're going to be forced to fire some people in your department because we need to come up with budget cuts. So he is actually making the right choice, because if he decides, no, I'm going to go and go with this weekend trip, he's essentially choosing that weekend trip with his family at the cost of other people's jobs. And that's a decision that I would make so quickly. I'd be absolutely, I'm working this weekend, no problem. And he's villainized in this movie for making that choice, and it just seems so silly. And that's why I said at the beginning of this review, like, this is geared towards kids, because I don't see an adult seeing this movie and thinking that Christopher Robin is the villain, because he has to make that choice. There's, as far as I'm concerned, there's no other choice that you make. And what really bugs me about this movie is the fact that he talks to his wife about this and he doesn't tell her the situation. He just says to her that he has to work and that it can't be avoided, and they're just going to have to go on without him. And she throws a big fit, obviously, because this is probably something that happens a lot in their relationship. And I agree with that. Like, you definitely should put more emphasis on your family than your work. And that's one thing that I really like about my job, is the fact that, yeah, I might be a little overqualified for it, but I get paid pretty well. And once I clock out, I don't have to think about it again until I go back to work. So that's one thing that I really do enjoy about my job. So I get that. But if he had just fucking explained it to his wife, like, what bitch would be like, no, you're coming with us. I don't care that these people are going to get fired. Like, I think she would understand, but he never explains it to her. Like, immediately when I saw this movie, like, after I got off, like, I was thinking about it and I was like, why didn't he just explain it to her? And I'm like, well, it's like late 40s and it's a different age. Like, maybe he was just like, well, it's my business. It's not her business. She's the woman. And then I thought to myself, I'm giving this movie way too much fucking credit. There's no way that they thought about that. It's just a plot hole that they didn't think about. And so, I mean, that just really bothered me. And I'm not even like halfway through this movie yet. And I already have like a ton of stuff that that really bothers me about this movie. But then really, once you kind of get to that second act into the third act, it's just like predictable, boring mess. And I just didn't really care about it. So yeah, I never really bought into this movie because, like I said, in broad strokes, like they villainized Christopher Robin and he was making the right choice. And that's why I could never really buy into this movie.
What about the other choices he makes, like deciding, like, against everyone else's wishes, he's going to send his daughter away to boarding school, and when she wants to read a story, he's like reading some garbage educational book. Like, what about the choices he makes as a father?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that he's not the best, but I mean, he was sent away to boarding school, and I think it was just like one of those things where I don't know if they were just kind of going for the fact that like he thought it was the best thing for her because that's what he did. Like in retrospect, He thought that he got something out of it as a grown up looking back on his time at boarding school, but they never really developed that. It's just like he's sending her away because that's what happened to him. Like they tried to develop that later on in the movie, but it never really worked for me. As far as the reading of the story, maybe that's just him being completely like having tunnel vision and not understanding that that's not what she wants. And that he's just trying to be like a super parent and trying to like get her ready for boarding school and not understanding that that's not necessarily what kids want, especially for reading at bedtime. Like they want like this fantastical story instead of like reading, I think like a encyclopedia or some shit. Like I don't know exactly what he was reading out of, but it was pretty boring. So yeah, I think that was just him being kind of tone deaf to the situation. I mean, he was trying to be a good dad. Like I didn't interpret that scene as being him being a terrible father. I just interpreted it as him being tone deaf.
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate. I don't necessarily disagree with where you're coming from.
For sure. So, performances wise, what do you think of Christopher Robin?
I honestly didn't have really any complaints. Like I really like Ewan McGregor, and I thought that he did a great job as Christopher Robin. I also like Haley Atwell quite a bit, and she is also great. I think when you take into account, especially on the Ewan McGregor side of things, that he is literally probably acting alongside stuffed animals because they go back later and obviously animate them and add the voices, that kind of adds to his performance. I do think that a lot of the supporting actors were kind of almost too cartoonish, and I know that's probably the vibe they were going for, but people like Mark, let's see, what's his name? Mark Gatiss, who plays his boss, or some of the actors that play his coworkers. Like I know that they're supposed to be kind of representative of the Pooh characters, but they're almost too over the top and too cartoony. So, I mean, you could argue that those performances weren't very great, but I'd say for the most part, everybody kind of hits the nail on the head. I think especially the voice actors. Jim Cummings, I'm really glad, like, you know, with Piglet and with Tigger and Eeyore and Owl and Rabbit, they kind of went for bigger name actors, but I'm really glad that they kept Jim Cummings for Tigger and for Pooh, because he's done those voices for a long time and he is an amazing voice actor. Like if you go to his filmography and look at all of the voices he's done, like he's all over the place and he's done quite a few Disney voices. So I'm glad that they kind of kept those really unique voices to him. But the other people they brought in, like Brad Garrett for Eeyore, or who was it? Wasn't it? I thought it was Toby Jones for Piglet, but it was Nick Mohammed for Piglet. Like he did fine. Peter Capaldi was Rabbit. He did fine. Like definitely no complaints there. Toby Jones actually did Owl, and he was fine. So I'd say the voice acting work was good too, especially again, Jim Cummings. I'm glad that he got to do these voices in a feature-length film.
Yeah, for sure. And that is probably the part of this movie that I appreciated the most, aside from maybe that montage sequence that I talked to earlier, was the performances. Like, I think everybody did a really good job. They just didn't have much to work with. And I do agree, kind of going by my my little notes that I did take for this movie is Ewan McGregor did a fantastic job, especially considering that he was acting against nobody. Haley Atwood isn't bad. I mean, she hasn't asked to do much, so I think she did all right. It's just I kind of wish that they didn't ask her to be like one note the whole movie, which I think is kind of what it was. She was just kind of filler in this movie. I did think that the daughter was really good too, especially if you judge, like we always say, like you're kind of grading on a curve with child actors. I think she did a pretty good job in that sense. I liked the Brad Garrett was Eeyore. I thought that was kind of a perfect casting, so I really appreciate that. And I do agree with you with Jim Cummings. I did appreciate that he was he did a good chunk of the voices, and I think that he did a good job giving them distinct voices. Like it didn't just sound like the same person doing two different voices. Like he definitely did give them distinct voices, which I appreciate. And I mean, the other voices they weren't really that much involved in the movie. Like you really just had Pooh, Tigger, and then Eeyore. Piglet a little bit, but I mean, for the most part, it was just those big three that were really in the movie. Like Owl and Rabbit, they were still kind of left behind. Like they didn't really weren't too involved in this movie. But yeah, everything about the performances I really liked. It was kind of the one aspect of this movie that I did appreciate.
Awesome.
All right, so the last bit that I want to talk about, and we normally like talk about like action or comedy, which is not much of either one of those things in this movie, but I did want to kind of talk about what you thought about the CGI in this movie now, and kind of like the character design, because a lot of these characters are CGI. So yeah, I kind of wanted to take a little bit and talk about that. So how do you think the look of these characters? What do you think about that?
I think some were better than others. I think that it was probably a tough task to come up with character designs for these characters, because if you made them look like they did from the cartoons, it would have made the movie feel really weird. So the animators were tasked with coming up with the design of these characters that looked familiar, but also looked like stuffed animals. And I think for the most part, they did a pretty good job. I think when the trailer for this film first came out, it caught a little grief because they said the characters looked almost scary. And I don't know that I'd go that far, but I think for Pooh, Piglet, and Tigger, I thought the animation was really great. But for like Rabbit, Owl, and Kanga and Roo, well, no, maybe not Kanga and Roo, but like for Rabbit and Owl specifically, they look like a rabbit and an owl as opposed to stuffed animals. So I don't know that the character design for those two were as good as the other ones, but I thought that the animation was really well done for the most part. I mean, it's hard to shit on animation anymore because it's come such a long way. Like I felt like these creatures in this world looked like legitimate stuffed animals interacting with Christopher Robin and his family.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the people that said that they looked a little creepy. Like, not just the CGI, like, creature design of them, but just, like, being whatever, what was it, 100-acre forest or whatever it's fucking called. Like, even that, like, I know it's supposed to be, like, foggy at a part of the movie, and it just feels, like, kind of dark and gloomy. And then you have the characters, the, like, Piglet and whatnot, like, they kind of look creepy. It was just kind of weird. Like they made some of them like look like stuffed animals, but then like Owl and Rabbit look exactly like an owl and rabbit. So that they kind of made those characters lifelike, and that was kind of weird and off-putting a little bit. So I do kind of agree that the characters were kind of weirdly animated. And I will say that even though Ewan McGregor did a great job acting against CGI characters, like we talked about in the performances, there were a couple of times where, like, I think Pooh had to hand him something or something like that, and you could definitely tell that he was, like you could definitely tell that Pooh was animated. Like, I think they did a really good job of making it look like it wasn't animated. Like, I think the animation and CGI have come to a point where it's almost kind of hard to tell at a certain point, but like when you had to have them like interact super close. I think it was really easy for you to tell that it was animation. So I do kind of knock this movie a little bit, just a tiny bit for that. But for the most part, other than the kind of the creepy design, I thought that they did a pretty good job.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so star rating out of 5 stars. What'd you think of Christopher Robin?
I am giving this a 3.5.
Really? We are way off. I did not like this movie, apparently. I gave it a 2.
A 2?
Yeah, I hated this movie, man.
Jesus Christ. You're a grumpy old man.
I guess. I mean, I said, like I said, this movie made me feel like an old man.
I felt like we were kind of
I felt like Scrooge in this movie.
I felt like we were kind of in line as we said our feelings around it. But yeah, we're definitely on other ends of the spectrum here.
And maybe I overemphasize it, but I can't get over the plot holes that I talked about in the story. Like, I can't get bought into anything that happens in the third act. And I didn't mention this when we talked about the story, but his final solution to the problem is really fucking stupid and lazy writing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spoil it either, but I mean, to that extent, I think that those types of plot points are where it shows that this movie is made for a younger audience. And I think that's sure. At the end, like, of the day, that's why I walked away a little bit more disappointed, is because with me judging by the trailer, it looked like it was maybe for adults just as much as it was for kids. But at the end of the day, like, Winnie the Pooh is something for not even kids, like younger kids. So just something that didn't play as well for us, I guess, and especially not you, apparently.
For sure. So we end each episode by kind of just doing a nerd favorite. We take turns. We ask each other a nerdy question. Obviously, the topic changes from episode to episode. It's my turn to pick the topic. And I wanted to do something a little bit different. Well, it's actually a lot different. There was recently an episode of The Obsessive Viewer, which I did not mean to plug them twice in one episode, but that's just kind of how it happens. They did an episode where Matt is like obsessed with Letterboxd, and they did a really fun episode where it's kind of like they do a thing which is very similar to what we do at the beginning, what we're into, but they call it potpourri, and they kind of did it like an extended potpourri episode. But instead of just kind of going back and forth, what they did was they opened each other's Letterboxd feeds, so their diaries on that social media site that we plug time in and time out. And they plug it really hard. And they basically just asked each other their thoughts on a particular movie that was in each other's diary. And so I thought that would be kind of fun to kind of do like a miniature version of that for Nerd Favorite. So I do have your Letterboxd pulled up. And I wanted to just kind of scrolling through some of these you have talked about with what you're into, you've talked about on past episodes, or we, of course, reviewed them on past episodes. So the movie that popped out to me that I did not think looked very good, and I'm kind of interested in getting your thoughts because it looks like you gave it 3 stars. So obviously you would recommend it because that's kind of our threshold for a recommend, is Ocean's 8. What do you feel about Ocean's 8?
Yeah, so my wife and I went and saw this one afternoon, and obviously I didn't talk about it on the podcast, but I liked it. I would put it above probably Ocean's 12 and 13. I haven't seen those movies in quite a while, but it played pretty well. It was almost a lower scope than those movies. The heist that the ladies do is not quite as intense as like robbing a casino, but there were parts that were funny. It's a great ensemble cast. So yeah, like I would definitely recommend it, but it's by no means going to be on my top 10 or anything for the year.
Yeah, my wife really wanted to see this, and she kind of busted my balls about it because I had almost no interest in seeing this movie. And I actually do like Ocean's 11 quite a lot. I actually watched all 3 of those movies not too long ago. It was probably a few months ago, but not too terribly long. And I really don't like Ocean's 13. I just don't think it's a very good movie. And what was it? I think it was Michael Scott makes a joke in The Office where it's like, oh, I don't want this to be like the Ocean's movies where it's just, they just get to get together and have fun as a cast. Like, I want it still to be a good movie. And I just kind of feel like that. I think about that scene from The Office every time I watch Ocean's 13. Like, it just, I'm not having fun watching it. They're obviously just having much more fun making it than I am watching it. So that's kind of why I didn't want to see Ocean's 8. It's just because I'm kind of over that concept, and I just didn't have any interest in seeing it. But I'm glad that you liked it, and I probably eventually will see it.
Yeah, there are a couple twists throughout the plot that are kind of obvious and then don't really make a lot of sense when they come around. Kind of like the twists in Ocean's 11, even though those made a little bit more sense. So that was a downside. And another downside to the movie, it's kind of a spoiler, but they reveal it in the first 5 minutes of the movie, so it's nothing too crazy. They kill Danny Ocean off screen. So, so if in case you don't realize, Sandra Bullock plays his sister, and it starts with her in prison, and they're interrogating her for parole, and she makes a comment about her brother being dead, and there's various points in the movie where she goes to his grave, and I guess there's, you know, the possibility, like they even make a joke about it, like maybe he's faking his death. So I guess that they have a loophole in case they wanted to bring George Clooney back at some point, but yeah, they just pretty much murder him off screen, which didn't sit right.
Yeah, that's weird. That sucks.
Yeah. So cool. I did the same thing, obviously. I pulled up your Letterboxd and was kind of going through, and kind of similar to what you were saying. A lot of these we've already talked about, or you've already brought up on your own. But there was one movie that stood out to me that it looks like you probably watched recently that I've never heard of. And then I looked at the cast, and the cast isn't too bad, really. So I was interested in what you thought. It looks like it has a pretty bad rating. So I'm curious if you agree, because you don't have a star rating on here for this movie yet. It's called, I probably pronounced it wrong, Tau? T-A-U?
Okay, so this is a... I didn't put a star rating on it. I usually will kind of do a little bit of batching where, like, I'll be at work, get bored, and kind of do it all at the same time. And I also, not that I think a ton of our listeners like pay too much attention to my Letterboxd feed, but like if we're going to review a movie, or like 8th Grade is the last thing that I have on my feed, like I don't want to give it a review or a star rating because I'm going to talk about it on the podcast, and I don't want to spoil it, essentially spoil the episode. So I usually do a little bit of batching where I'll do a bunch of them at the same time at work or something. So that's why I don't have a star rating for this movie. So this movie essentially it's a Netflix movie, and it's about this woman who gets kidnapped, and she's forced to take part in this study. And it's kind of hard for me to even explain what this movie's about, because it never captured my attention from the get-go. Like the very beginning of it is like this futuristic kind of like Blade Runner feel to it, but then once it really gets going, it's super fucking boring. And I felt like I was basically just on my phone most of the movie, because after about the first act, I just did not care about this movie. It had a cool look to it. I thought that I was going to really enjoy it. It kind of felt like, it kind of had the same like futuristic, gringy kind of vibe as like maybe like Upgraded. Like that kind of, or Upgrade, I think, is that what that movie's called? And I really liked that movie quite a lot. This movie just did not have a story. Like it had like a short story, and then they just stretched it out to like an hour and a half, and it just felt super, super long. Gary Oldman is the voice of this like AI, and I mean, it just sounds like Gary Oldman, and it's just super, super distracting. But yeah, it was. I think I even tweeted out about this, like the main character in this movie is, and I can't remember her name off the top of my head. She was in It Follows. She's the main girl in It Follows. And I tweeted out a joke, like, cause she gets kidnapped in this movie. I was like, it's just super easy to kidnap her. Like, cause she's kidnapped in this other movie that I know her from. And just, I don't know. After the first like 20 minutes of this movie, I just was not interested at all.
Gotcha. Yeah, it didn't look like it had fared very well with reviews, so.
It looked interesting to me, and I knew that it didn't get a very good, I think it's like 20% or something like that on Rotten Tomatoes. It might not even be that high, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot because it looks really cool. And then immediately I checked out.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's pretty stupid and boring.
Gotcha, man.
All right, so that's it for episode 201 of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast. As always, we hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that subscribe button on iTunes, rate, review us on iTunes. That really, really helps us out. This is a very saturated genre, and so more reviews and more ratings that we get, the more it kind of gets us away from all of the other movie and TV podcasts. So we definitely appreciate that. You can also check us out on Stitcher Radio and basically any good podcatcher you use. We're probably on it. You can check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which I do a lot of my gaming stuff. I'm a huge gamer. Don't really talk about it too much on the podcast. And that's kind of the reason we have the YouTube channel. So definitely check that out if you're into gaming as well. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Google+. And you can email us at thenerdsyou'relooking4@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
we are the Nerds You're Looking For. Take it easy, nerds.
Ta-ta for now.